Because in many cases, because there are conflict, there is no consensus, there are contradictory goals, one way to do something is to agree on technical details and develop policy instruments that nobody understands very well, which have long-term effect. So can I emphasize the fact that when we developed all this analysis on policy instrumentation, it was based on our empirical work in economic policy, urban policy, environment policy, social policy, where we saw in a number of cases the rise of only one thing people could agree with very strong effect, which were the policy instruments. All this with the same goals and the same discourse. Okay? So that was the logic of our argument. Of course, this idea is not new, and there's a large body in social science, generally speaking, which have emphasized this technical element and you may have in sociology all the classic work of Renato Mainz or Koyman on ungovernable society and the search for new policy instruments to govern network. There's a lot about that. We remember Max Weber and all this analysis of the state as a machinery with very strong element on this policy instruments element. We know that the science studies movement has been very, very strong, and Harry being a distinguished member of that corporation. And remember that what is interesting also, very often there's a debate, I know I'm more familiar with Latour and Calon, of course, on the extent to which they are more or less constructivist, and I will come back to this constructivist element. But what is quite interesting, I would argue, in this project was precisely to link some discourse to some material dispositif, and this materiality of either institutions or instruments seems to me very, very strong, important. We know also that in management, the critical management studies movement, particularly in business schools in the UK, has been very strong to emphasize the importance of categories, of plans, of ways of rankings on the output and the implications. We also know all the classical analysis of Foucault on activities of government and dispositif. We also know about this public policy movement in Canada from Howlett and Salomon and all these people, slightly functionalist, I must say, but which try to develop some elements. So what we're doing is absolutely nothing new. We're trying to be more precise and to see what we can do with be systematic and how far we can go in understanding issues of governance, public policy, and this innovation. Because in a way, in terms of innovation, what we know is that historically, when you had either restructuring of a state or new wave of large public policy, like the developments of the welfare state after the war, that is always linked historically to a lot of innovation in terms of policy instruments. So if you want to understand the development, governance, public policy, state restructuring, focusing on this element is one good way to enter. It may be very deterministic, it may be marginal, but it's a good angle to understand, try to think about various things. So in a way, it's also a way to try to go beyond all this literature, like the world is complex and ungovernable, so we all lost and postmodern and all that. We don't believe that. We believe that in many, many sectors, there are lots of interesting effects, but we see lots of, we still see power, we still see inequalities, we still see a lot of regulations. So our view, in a way, is classic, robust social scientists who are interested to understand in this governance of societies and all this transformation of public policies. We still think that there are lots of power and interest and discourse, but classic thing that we want to understand. Okay, so we are not functionalist at all and not completely beyond all this material side. So we try to understand if we're correct, then looking at those policy instruments is also a way to look at questions of power. And you have to think about various categories, and you have to think about the way various groups will try to develop some strategies around those elements. It's not because you move away from classic view of government that you don't have power relationship. No, this is absolutely not something you should be, it's quite obvious. So I will not develop the analytical framework in very precisely, but just as a definition, we look at policy public instruments with two dimensions. For us, what is important is that the policy instruments carries at the same time a technical element, and that's the link with a lot of the innovation literature. There's a technical element in it. And second, there's a social and political element. When you create a policy instrument, there is a view of the world, a relationship to politics, a way to think about governing society, which is present in particular. The second point is that in order to put things clearly, we are, in a way, a little bit neo-institutionalists. I mean, I say we because I work with Pierre Lascoum and a group of people from Philippe Bezès, Boraz, and the rest of them. And we think that in many ways, an instrument is a material side, like an institution. So we take the sociological definition of the institution. The idea that when you have a policy instrument, this technical element, it's something relatively stable, it's not changing all the time, there's an element of fixity that you try to characterize at some given moment, and there are some constraints for action. Okay? It makes political action and social action feasible, but it's also a constraint for actors when it is put into place. Classic analysis. Huh? So really the key point, which is very obvious really, but the problem is that most of the literature, including in public policy, tend to see policy instruments as completely neutral. You know, you have a rational decision maker, he has a cupboard, and when the politicians have decided on the policies, then the rational policymakers open the cupboard and say, what is the best policy instruments for the policy? And of course, they choose the best policy instruments and all goes well. Well, we argue that that may not be a very good view. And there's a very strong functional bias in the literature. We are not completely constructivist, and it's one of the discussion. In a way, I tend to argue that when you do social science, you need to be constructivist, because you need to think about the categories, you need to think about deconstructing various elements. But at some point, we tend to believe there are some strong elements getting into place, some stabilization going on, some rules of the game, which will have some very strong constraints on action. So we are moderate constructivist. That's our position, I would argue. So we don't think that discourse always changing everything. Sometimes, not always. So we believe that when you think about this choice of instrument in a public policy, in a governance strategy, what you see into that is more than just let's get the right tool, but you have a sort of implicit theory of relationship between a political relationship between those who governed and those who are governed. It's a condensed form of knowledge. So they are not neutral devices either, which is the second point. Policy instruments, like any institutions, produce specific effects, which are independent from the objective. You could see the impact of some instruments independently from the objective. And they structure public policy and the governance result, the outcomes, according to their own logic. So that's the idea. In other words, for us, what is important is not public policy instruments as such, but rather the process of choosing the instruments, the instrumentation process, where you will see some struggles between various views of the world, where you will see some power groups trying to modify and orientate the policy according to their own goals. And public policy instrumentation could be defined as a choice and use of instrument, allowing government policy to be made operational. So you try to understand not just the reasons towards the choice, but also trying to think about the effect. And your classic case, if you want to have some economic policy, giving discrete tax credit to some groups is not the same thing than using massive political mobilization and public money to spend on a program. I always give this example on housing in the French context. When you talk about housing, everybody in France says, oh yeah, social housing costs a lot of money because it's a big, the tax the spending of the budget, public expenditure on social housing is quite high. What nobody says is that there's one bit of budget which is even higher. It's all the small tax credits, small niche, small exemption, which allow private developers to get huge amount of public money to build all sorts of houses and sometimes ugly buildings. And the overall cost over the years is far more important than the cost of social housing. Okay? So when you choose one instrument or the other one, there's strong implications for what sort of houses you build.